Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Itential webinar. Today, we're going to be focusing on auditing network security vulnerabilities from Cisco PSIRTs in this example, but this is not something that's specific to Cisco, using the Itential automated configuration compliance. And this solution is focused around the Itential platform on how we can use the tooling that we have to audit configurations and look for those vulnerable configurations that we get thrown at us every time we see advisories. Uh, the timing of this, I think it's probably due. I think we had one bundled security advisory from Francisco last week for iOS XR. This is totally applicable to any operating system, Francisco, Arista, Juniper, the usuals and not the so usuals, to detect configurations that are impacted by any CVEs. And also, we wanted to release this because the iOS bundled security publication is due either this week or next week. So it'd be a good idea to kind of go through and do a refresher on how to use Itential's capability to detect some of these and then produce some reporting. There are various challenges with creating reporting for advisory, right? This is one of those tasks that engineers have to do and network engineers have to do more specifically, but don't necessarily prepare for this, right? A lot of people don't necessarily focus or prepare for doing this throughout the entire year. I did several years of consulting. I worked for Cisco for 10 years. And one of the things that I had to do throughout the many years that I worked there was actually support our customers throughout the releases of these advisories, right? And sometimes we had to build custom reporting due to demands from executives, right? Somebody says, I want to know from our entire infrastructure what devices are impacted by this PSIRT that just came out last week. Or sometimes we have to do it on demand based on some of these industry-wide advisories that we get hit with every now and then. We get these advisories on the customer, on the vendor's website, and we get some details from those advisories, but there's not a lot of clear path on how we get from there to actually identifying what is vulnerable on our infrastructure, right? Sometimes we get an email, we get a link from our support people saying, hey, you might be impacted by these, but we don't have necessarily the tooling necessary a lot of times to actually go ahead and check on the environment against our real devices. What we're trying to do today is kind of demonstrate how Itential provides the capability to add new advisory checks very quickly and compare them against your environment so you can assess any potential vulnerabilities and potential threats in the future to your environment, how to prepare these so that they can be executed on demand or scheduled as well, right? One of the things that becomes really important is once we execute the first check against the environment, we want to go and figure out an action plan and remediate those as we can, right? A lot of times we're not able to just submit configuration immediately to remediate those, or sometimes we have to upgrade software, and that requires planning, it requires maintenance windows, approvals, and so forth. So from then on, we actually want to make sure that we execute ongoing checks against the environment to make sure that we're tracking what gets remediated and what is left to be remediated. So the schedule piece of this becomes really key, and having the reusability of whatever automation we design so that we can use it in the future for any new advisories that get released. One of the other pieces that's really important is that some of these advisories are very easy to identify by just looking at potential configuration parameters that are identified as vulnerable, right? So some of the ones that we're going to be keying on today are the usual suspects, right? Things like telnet, things like HTTP server running on the devices, HTTP secure server, and so on. But there are also some other parameters that may not be as easy to identify, right? Things like crypto, IKV1, for example, is one of those that you don't necessarily need to configure it in order for it to be running on the device, right? If the device may have some features in the back end that are using some of those protocols that may be affecting the device, and you may not know it, right? So that requires also not just auditing configurations, but also auditing the operational state of the device. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is actually looking at both aspects of this, right? How do we audit configuration that's existing on the device? And also, how do we audit operational data? By issuing show commands live on the device and actually checking against certain parameters that we want, right? For example, executing a show crypto ISACamp peers and making sure that we have that we don't have any peers active on IP1, or making sure that we don't have any SAs active and so forth, right? And lastly, the reporting piece of this, right? So we actually are going to showcase how we can utilize basic HTMLs or basic tooling that we have available, and we can use things like ChatGPT and so forth to build that basic HTML templates that we can use for reporting, and using Itential's integrations actually display this in the tool itself. But not only that, but also be able to send it as an email, right? Today, we're going to demonstrate how we send a report over email. And that becomes very useful for those scheduled runs where we just get an email at night and we say, hey, this is compared against live the environment and so forth. But then there's also the other plethora of integrations that exist within the Itential platform that you can use for this, namely Microsoft Teams, Slack, or any other systems, right? We could actually have these reports being attached to a change request in something like ServiceNow, or incident creation, or in Salesforce and so forth. So for the demo portion of this, what we're going to do is we're going to be focusing on compliance piece and in the golden config application of the Itential platform to identify those vulnerable features on iOS XE devices. We're going to use 2 or 3 iOS XE devices I have in my lab for this, and those have been, they have some configurations in it that purposefully are impacted, so that we can just go ahead and showcase those and see how we go about creating reporting for those in the format that we have decided. So we're going to go live and create a golden config to do this. For the actual configuration parameters identified, we're also going to use command templates to audit operational features, like I was explaining before, right? Some of these vulnerabilities cannot be identified by just looking at the config, but we actually have to execute show commands to identify the operational state of some of those features. So we're going to go ahead and do those. And we're going to use those two together. And we're going to execute a reusable workflow that we have that will scan the devices and will generate a report for us and show it to us in the tool on the platform, as well as be able to send it via email so that we can notify our teams or everybody else and showcase how we use the Itential integration to actually make those reports meaningful to the organization, not just us. And lastly, we're going to demonstrate how we can publish this automation via a manual method so that we can actually expose the automation to be executed on demand. We can also create an API for the automation so that it can be executed by somebody else using their scripts, and they can get their reports on demand as well. And also scheduling so that we can showcase how we can execute this, let's say, every day at 1 a.m. or the like. With that said, let's switch into the platform and see how we can go about this. Okay, so now that we're on the platform here, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to design a golden config. So for that, I'm going to go into Configuration Manager, and I am going to create a new golden configuration, and I'm going to call it, let's see, PSIRT bundle September 2024. Let's do March. I'm using March PSIRTs mostly as the example for this. So I'm going to use some of those PSIRTs that were published in March. So we're just going to do that for this. So PSIRT bundle March 2024 report. And that's going to be very important because the automation that we built that is reusable, we can actually point it to a golden configuration that we have designed. And we need to remember this name. So this name is actually going to copy it here and save it on my handy dandy notepad here for later, because we will use this. The automation that we have designed is actually reusable. So we can point it towards any golden configuration that we had designed, and it'll create the report dynamically at the time that we execute that automation. So let's go ahead and create. That automation is for Cisco iOS, this one specifically. So we're actually going to keep things fairly simple. And I'm not going to get, one of the things, if you have seen the Itential webinars in the past, we actually have a hierarchical capability to design the golden config tracing here that allows you to actually drill down into different levels of creating children nodes in here so that you can create golden configs for things like regional or you can create different nodes for different platforms and different devices and so forth. Today, we're actually going to keep this fairly simple. So I'm actually going to delete that. And we're just going to use the base node. Since we're just looking across the board on all our devices, we want to look for these config commands that we have identified. So I'm actually going to start pulling commands here from my list that I have pulled up from the March PSIRT bundle. One of the things that we wanted to look for was crypto ICAM fragmentation, which is an IPv1 fragmentation vulnerability. Let's see. We will also have an IP DHCP snooping vulnerability. In this case, we're not going to find any of these because we're actually using routers for this, and this is not applicable. But I'm just going to put it in there anyway so that we get an idea of how this works for all those. We also had a Lisp command vulnerability. I'm just going to look for router Lisp. Obviously, if the device is running router Lisp or not, it's just going to remove it. So remediation strategy there has to be, different. But in this case, we're not focusing necessarily on remediation, but just an identification of the features that are enabled. And then I added a couple of the usual suspects, right? So I added HTTP server, HTTPS also being enabled, which is one of those features that not necessarily everybody runs, but sometimes are enabled on the devices. And I am also going to get a little fancy here, and I'm going to add a check for telnet inside VTY lines, right? Sometimes we see one of those obscure ones, then we say, nah, we're not running telnet on our devices, but it's good to check because I've been surprised very, very, very many times by customers saying we disallowed the use of telnet 10 years ago, and we go and walk through the infrastructure and we find 100 devices running telnet. So I have added a checking here. Now, one of the things that is interesting and different here is that we're actually, what this denotes is we're using regular expressions for this. So what I have done here is I have said, and because we're identifying vulnerable commands only, I want to look at the stuff that I don't want to be in the environment, and we'll do that in a second. But I actually want to check if we have transport input telnet and SSH, I have it as allowed. Essentially, what I'm saying here is this is a conditional statement. So if SSH exists, I don't care. That's completely fine by me. I only want to focus on if the command has telnet in it. Hopefully, there's something else in there. Nobody should be configuring our login or anything like that these days, but you never know. So I just want to focus on those. So the other thing that we want to do here is because I am looking for the existence and I want to disallow these commands. I don't want them to exist. Is I want to flag the stuff as disallow on the platform. So I'm going to actually change the colors here from dark into white background just so we can see this better. So I actually want to go here and say disallow. And that'll do it for these here as well as this one. What that is saying is telling the platform, whenever we walk the config of the device, if you find these specific commands, let's flag them. They should not be on the device, okay? So that's the logic, right? It's a little inverse here, right? Traditionally, the use of golden config is we want to put every single command that we want on the device, and we're auditing to see if they're missing. In this case, we're actually using inverse logic. So we're using the functionality in the platform to detect the stuff that's in the config that we don't want. This is why we're disallowing the majority of these commands. I am not disallowing line VTY 0 through 4 because we want that to exist, right? We want to log into the devices. I just want to disallow this subcommand in this case, which is transport input telnet with the optional SSH parameter that I don't care about. Okay. So I will hit an update here so that we can save that. And then the other thing that I got to do is add devices into this golden config. Now, this is very important, especially for this use case. I want to add devices here because what happens is the way that this automation is designed, we are actually going to only focus on the devices that are added into this golden config. So we're going to ignore the rest of the devices. And as such, I need to add them in here first. That way, when I go and run my operational checks, right, look at my show commands, and I use my command template feature for that, I can actually pass those device names to the command template. There are multiple options to address this. I can actually have the user provide a list of devices in the form, or I could have other mechanisms where I can read the list of devices from some source of truth, some inventory tool. I could go and query, let's say, something like a DSIM or a netbox or something like that, that I can say, hey, give me all the devices that are iOS routers, and I will audit against those. Multiple options to go about this. In this case, I wanted to keep this as simple as possible because what we want to showcase is how you can do this on demand very quickly a couple days before the PSIRT or a couple days after you get the PSIRT, so that you can address that demand or that ask from your executives or somebody that's requesting a report showcasing what devices are affected. Okay, so now our config compliance is built. We have our devices added. We have our name recorded. I'm just going to keep that tab in there just in case. But from here on out, we can actually move on and build our second piece of our checks, which is our operational commands using our command template feature. So I'm actually going to jump into my project here inside of IAP, which is a self-contained set of assets that belong to the automation. And you are right now are looking at the workflow canvas. But before we go ahead and focus on the workflow canvas, I want to go ahead and build that command template that we talked about. So let's build a new asset in here, and we're going to build a command template, and we're going to call it, let's see, let's use the same name that we use for the golden config. They're not going to clash because they're different asset types, but I just want to make sure that I keep everything consistent across the board, so that when I go ahead and execute my automation, I remember the things that I'm gonna execute against. So let's build that command template. Now from here on, I have several commands that I have picked out on things to go ahead and check. There are some commands that are very simple and some that are more complicated. So I'm going to start by some of those that are a little bit simpler. So I'm going to go with the usual suspects, right? The HTTP server. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy and paste here from my handy dandy notepad. So I want to check for show IP HTTP server status, and I'm filtering this to include status only. That's the only one that I really care about. I want to make sure that it says that if it's enabled or not. Like I said before, in this case, we're actually looking for the things that we don't want to see on the config. So I want to see this output, which is HTTP server status enabled. If that exists on the device, then I want to report on that. If I don't see that, namely if it's disabled, then I don't want to worry about it. So that's what we're going to do across the board for all the commands. Let's do the next one over, which is secure server status. The output for that also shows up on the show IP HTTP server, but I want to make sure that I'm thorough and I report these individually. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Let's see. We're going to do a contains in here, and we're going to do secure server status enabled. And then let's add a couple more. So now we start getting into the more interesting stuff. So we're going to look at IKV1 vulnerability. And like I said before, IKV1 is one of those that's a little bit tricky. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you don't have it configured that you're not running it. There are some things in the background that use it, that run IKV1 features, and you want to make sure that it's operationally that it's not running. So we're going to actually use a show crypto ISACamp SA. That tells me if there's an SA actually active on the device, meaning that there's interesting traffic traversing it and it's matching some sort of crypto policy, and it's actually encrypting using IKV1 for phase 1 encryption. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use that show crypto ISACamp SA, but I don't necessarily want to look at the whole output. I actually want to look at whether I see any IP addresses on that output, right? And that tells me that there's actually interesting traffic and we're actually matching and building an SA. So I'm actually going to use a regular expression here. And we're going to keep it fairly simple, right? We don't want to get too complicated with the regular expression, right? I heard an expression the other day that said, when you have to build a regular expression to solve a problem, now you have two problems. So we want to keep it very simple. So right now what I'm doing is I'm building a regular expression that finds an IP address format string. And this is just looking for 4 digits separated by dots, right? You can get really crazy with this stuff. You can go from numbers from 0 to 255 or realize that's what an IP address format looks like. I'm just trying to keep it simple to kind of demonstrate the functionality there. I'm actually going to flag this as global there so that it finds it on the entire output as one match. And then we're going to get into an application visibility control command that I had seen. Now, this one may not necessarily produce an output on the devices that I have, but I wanted to make sure that I include it just so that I can showcase how we can actually look for multiple rules, right? Actually establish multiple rules against that particular command. So this is a show ABC SD service info detailed. We have it filtered in here as well. And there is a couple rules that we need to look against. And one of them is DCS enabled? So we're going to do a contains rule here. And we're going to say, is DCS enabled true? But also, another thing that I want to look at in here is this is learn Mac on FIF true. And this is one of the things that kind of allows me to showcase all the functionality of the platform, right? So I can actually build multiple rules and can get very granular because the way that I read this advisory was these conditions both have to be true. So this actually allows me to build and look against this command output and check, is DCS enabled true and is LearnMac on FIF true. Both conditions have to be true, and that is controlled by this knob right here. If I just wanted one rule, if one of these two identifies the device as vulnerable, then I flick it and set it to one rule must pass. In this case, I actually want to have it as all rules must pass, as the advisory was saying that these both have to be true in order for the device to be identified as vulnerable. Okay, so I think that looks good. Let's review this again. So we have 4 commands total that we want to report against. And we have our logic set up already, regex, blah, blah, blah. That looks good. So we're going to go ahead and save that. And now we got both our golden config design for the parameters that we have picked out earlier from that March PSIRT bundle, and also our command template design for this. Now let's go ahead and review the actual workflow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this tab really quickly. And let's look at the workflow that we have designed for this first. So this is a fairly simple workflow. It has a handful of tasks in it. So I'm actually going to go ahead and walk through what it's actually doing really quickly at a very high level before we go ahead and demonstrate the functionality for this. So the first thing that we're going to do is this workflow gets launched via, like I mentioned before, it gets launched by either manually on demand by the user. It also can be launched by a schedule or via API. And we're going to showcase how we build all those triggers as well in a minute here before we go ahead and execute the actual automation. The workflow gets triggered, and the first thing that it's going to do is it's going to run config checks. So this is actually going to run a config compliance job. So it's actually using the modularity of the platform to actually reuse some workflows that we've used in the past to just run any config compliance trees that we built. So in this case, I'm just passing the tree ID, and let's go ahead and look at what that workflow looks like. So this actually this workflow here. So if I go ahead and double click, look at that reference. It's called run config compliance. We can actually go and pop in that workflow. It's fairly simple workflow. It runs config compliance for the node. It gets the report ID. It takes the report out, and then it does some parsing on the data. And we want to parse the data out in a format that our report can actually accept. But not only that, but so that I can do it for all the PSIRT reports that we want to run later in the future. So this is very commoditized, and that's why we build it in modularity like that, so that we can reuse these automations later in the future. From there on, I have to query a couple of parameters, query the device issues, and like I said, very importantly, the devices. So the devices that I assign in my config manager here to this tree will be actually queried out by this task here in order to pass it so that we can run show commands against it. And that's a very important piece, because we're actually, just to keep the automation very simple, we're actually controlling most of what we're running within the config manager application there. Then we execute our operational checks. We can look at that workflow as well. Very simple workflow. It just runs the command template and it parses the data to a particular format so that we can run that report later. And then from there, we execute a couple queries, do a little bit of data manipulation. We render a template. And our render template, essentially what it's doing between this task and this task here, what they're doing is actually rendering an HTML report that we have built for this. So within the platform, it actually gives me the capability, and we're using Jinja 2 for this, which is a very commonly known Python templating framework. It allows me to actually build very extensive reporting within the platform. I can just plug in my HTML report and actually pass it the data object from the results of my show commands and my config compliance, and actually build a pretty report, right? I can actually build some nice tables that have my device names. It actually has some command outputs within it. It'll tell me if a device is affected or not, and so forth. And you'll see those as we go through there. And then from there, we will showcase it in the automation live on demand. This is obviously not, this is an optional part of the automation, right? We can actually view it, or we can just bypass it. A lot of times we want to do this when we run the automation on demand, but whenever we run it scheduled, we just want to send that report somewhere, whether it is create an incident in some sort of CRM system, or we want to send it via email. In this case, we're just focusing on send this to my email. And because Outlook renders HTML very nicely, we'll actually get the results of that very quickly. So now that we have looked at the entire workflow and what it does, and it's actually a fairly simple one. The other thing that I want to highlight before we actually go into Operations Manager is that this workflow is reusable. The whole idea of this is, and as you saw before, right, I actually created the assets on the fly, and these are the ones that we're going to be actually using to run these checks against on the fly. The whole idea here is that if you had these in your Itential platform, you could actually go and build a config compliance and a command template very, very, very quickly. This is something that anybody can do. For the most part, you saw me doing just copying and paste, adding configs into a tool, which is basically what you do when you take things from a notepad and paste them on the device. So you can actually go through the advisories, paste those commands into your config manager or your command template tool, and then run the reusable workflow and get your report on demand, right? That's the whole idea and the way that this was designed. Now let's go ahead and look at how we go and actually expose this, and we can go ahead and run it. So I have actually created an automation in our operations manager already for this. And what that does is it ties that workflow to this automation. So I can get an on-demand entry for this. One of the things that I had done beforehand, actually before starting this, was actually I created a form against this. So I already have a manual mechanism to execute this. And what this form does is it actually dynamically populates all the golden config trees that I have built on the platform. So if you can see here, we actually already see the PSIRT bundle March 2024 report here, as well as the command template. So these are all dynamic. So I can actually see the PSIRT bundle March as well here. So those are the ones that we're going to execute against. Now, this is my on-demand use case, right? One of the things that we also talked about was how do we expose these in multiple ways? So I'm actually going to create a couple more triggers, and let's do the API trigger first. And we're going to call it API, and we're just going to put a API typing here, and we're going to call it endpoint. We're going to say this is a PSIRT report. So now when I save this, I have an API endpoint running on the platform that allows you to run this on demand, right? It allows you to say there's an API route that says PSIRT report. You can pass it a payload that includes the command template and the golden config, and it'll produce a report against it and send it over email, like we had talked about. Now, the other thing that we can do is, like I said before, you create these and you run them once. You don't want to sit here and click in the buttons every time. So probably the best use case for this is actually go ahead and schedule so that we can get a report and look at how your remediation is tracking over time. So we're going to create one that says nightly schedule, and we're going to go ahead and say this is a schedule. We're going to be repeating this thing, and we're going to be doing it at, let's see, we're going to be doing it at, where are we at here? Let's do 2 a.m., 2 a.m., 00. To make it simple here, let's do it at 2 a.m. and we're going to do it every day. So that's good. This is starting 9/16, so it's going to start. Actually, we want to do it starting tomorrow, and at 9/16 at 2 a.m. And this is going to repeat every one day. Process miss run, we're going to say none. Right, this is optional, and for that, and we're going to keep it there for now. And what that's going to do is that's going to run that every single day, and we can tie all the things to it as well. We can actually tie a form. Let's just tie a form here. I'm going to tie this form, and we're going to do, let's actually do PSIRT. This one. Okay, so now that actually saves it, and it's going to run against those every single night. So the one thing that's also important to note, and I was actually kind of thinking through this today as I was planning how to go ahead and showcase this, is I could actually create multiple entries of this. For example, I already have a test job. Let's do nightly schedule here for, let's do it for March bundle, right? But I also have a couple test automations. So let's do it just for September bundle, right? If I want to check for the September bundle as well, I could actually go ahead and reuse this same automation. And just go ahead and repeat, blah, blah, blah. Let's do none. And we're going to use the same form, but we're actually going to pass it the test jobs that I had done. And what this allows me to do is here now, I actually have the same automation being used to report against two completely different sets of advisories that I'm testing against, right? One is testing against the one that I just built, which is focused on the March 2024 PSIRT bundle, and the other one is focused on some test data that I was using before. So now that allows me to do this over and over again if I wanted to report. And as I go and deprecate, right, if it starts coming, if some of these reporting start coming empty because they're not as relevant anymore, I can go ahead and delete those triggers. So this allows me to kind of showcase a lot of the functionality that it gives us and a lot of the flexibility just with one simple automation that I had created and showcased earlier. For now, we're just going to run this on demand. So I'm going to go ahead and click on run now. We're going to go ahead and select our golden config and our operational checks template. So our golden config tree was called PSIRT bundle, and that's there. PSIRT bundle March 2024, perfect. Our command template's called PSIRT bundle March 2024 report as well. That's also selected there, and I'm just going to go ahead and click run now and see what happens. So now we see the automation running, and one of the things is that this is going to take a second because it's actually going and executing live against the devices. It's running against 3 devices, so it actually has to go and get a show run from each one of those and then compare them against the golden config. That's what the first piece of this automation does. And then from there, it'll actually turn around and execute the show commands as well to verify those. Let's just wait a second and see. Okay. Okay, that finished the config compliance checks, and it's now doing the operational checks. So it's actually executing all those show commands. So we specified 4 show commands into 3 devices. So it actually goes ahead and runs those. Then it queries to some data, renders that template very, very, very quickly, right? All the stuff that is not a CLI interaction runs fairly quickly. And now it gives us the ability to actually look at our report. Well, let's see what comes out of it. Okay, so now we actually see a report, how it was created before. And this is actually fairly basic HTML. You can get fairly creative with this. You can add and remove parameters as you see fit. This is meant to be an example to kind of showcase the functionality and the capability that is there. You could actually collapse those in one table. I just wanted to make sure that I separated them to kind of show the difference between each. And this shows me actually the results of what came out of my golden config. So it says that all my CSRs have these commands that are disallowed in the config. So it has ISACAM fragmentation enabled, router list is running, HTTP server is running, HTTPS, and then they also have transport input telnet enabled. These 2 do, the other one doesn't. iOS CSR AWS 3 does not have telnet running, so that's a good thing, but it has the rest of the stuff enabled. Now, as I had said before, right, some of these checks will actually require us to go into the devices and actually execute show commands. So it's not just config oriented. And that's what the operational check results kind of showcase at the bottom here. And you could go as simple or as complicated as you want here. You can showcase a lot of detail or very little detail. In this case, I actually wanted to make sure that I myself saw partial outputs of what those show commands were running so that I can actually validate by myself that this is actually the case. So I actually got evidence now of what's happening here. So I get my device name, I got showing my show software version. It says that it's affected, it's true, right? Because we have established some rules that said if HTTP server is enabled, we're going to flag that device is affected, and some commands is not affected, right? So this is for that AVC command that we had said before. And you can augment this to actually show the show command itself. There's one thing that I didn't do, but that can be done as well. One of the things that's very interesting here is, as you can see here, for the crypto commands, I can actually see that there's an active SA here on these 2 guys. So I actually see there's an active SA. So this device is actually effectively running IP1. And there's a couple more that are actually running it. So CSR AWS2 is also running IP1. The third one doesn't seem to be. But this shows me a fair amount of detail here. So this is a clean output down here. So it's not running, so it's not affected, which is a great thing to know here. So this device is fairly clean. The other ones are in trouble. The whole idea here is, like I said, to kind of showcase basic capability. This report could be very extensive. This could be, a lot more detailed. or less detailed as you see fit. Some people just want to see if the device is affected or not, and some people want to see a lot of more detail. So that's kind of catering to both audiences in here. The other thing that I also specified is this is an optional step in order to look at the report live on demand when we run the automation. But for the most part, we cared about the reporting after the fact, right? So we typically want to see this sent as an email, or perhaps, so I've had some customers that want to do this, like uploading this to some sort of web server or something like that that they can look at on a daily basis, right? This is one of those things that you look at in the morning, right, to make sure that you're in the know, and so that if somebody asks a question, you have the relevant answers for them. So from here, I'm just going to go ahead and hit proceed. And now the last task is going to be to send this over email. And let me go ahead and check my email. And I'm going to pop this out so that we can also see it. So yeah, so I got an email with my report. I'm not going to go over it because we already saw it live, but I'll actually see this from the platform. And like I said, now because I have scheduled that report, that automation to run every day at 2 a.m., and I scheduled actually twice, right? I've scheduled one for this data and one for the test data. I will get 2 emails whenever this executes every day, right? So it allows me to kind of do this very, very, very quickly. So we've been here for about 30 something odd minutes, and with me kind of ranting about capability and showcasing, but we were able to do this very quickly. Like I said, the whole idea is to kind of showcase how this is done in a very quick and easy manner, and more importantly, reusable, right? That we're able to run this over and over against different sets of data to make it as dynamic as we can so that we don't have to keep rebuilding the same automation all the time. Now, that concludes our webinar for today. Um, Again, like I said earlier, the whole idea was to kind of promote and give visibility to these capabilities ahead of the September PSIRT bundle for Cisco. One was released a week ago or so on the 16th, I believe it was, or a few days ago. And there's another one coming at some point. So hopefully this is useful for those of you that are our customers and those of you looking to become our customer. So let us know how we can help with this, and hopefully this was informative. Thank you and have a good rest of the day.